Hello, and welcome to your lecture, bridging the previous time period into our 1900 to the present time period. One of the things that the College Board wants to make sure that we address is the collapse of a lot of the old empires that we've been studying. The problem with doing that is that a lot of it is associated with World War I. So you're going to hear a couple of these things multiple times as a result of that. So here's the key concept, 6.21. It says Europe dominated the global political order at the beginning of the 20th century, but both land-based and transoceanic empires gave way to new states by the century's end. Specifically, they want us to address the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Qing empires, and their internal and external factors in regards to why they collapsed. Obviously, you do have to factor in World War I into the external factors with both the Ottoman and the Russian empires. The Qing is really associated with the Japanese being aggressive during this era, so keep that in mind as we go through this lecture. As far as social issue goes, all three of the empires had some major social problems. For the Ottomans, they had this massive population explosion due to Columbian exchange. So after the new foods that were reaching the old worlds, like the potatoes and the corn and things of that nature, the Ottomans experienced this population explosion that they were not prepared for. Their resources were not able to meet the needs of the populace. And so obviously, as a result of that, you're going to get a lot of social stratification happening in regards to the have and the have-nots. So we lose quite a bit of a middle class because of the lack of resources, and that's going to increase the tensions between the masses, or the lower classes, and of course the upper class, which is pretty much your janissaries and your royal family. As a result of that, the peasants started to flood into the cities, all the major cities throughout the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is huge at this point, at the beginning of the 19th century. And they actually end up creating more problems because there's less food being put into cultivation. And as a result of that, we end up with more social discontent because there is even a higher increased lack of food. Tanzimat was an attempt at reform that totally fails in regards to social, solving some of the social discontent. Tanzimat, while it did do things like try to equalize out the different ethnicities and create more law codes and put a little bit of enlightenment in there, it didn't really reach the lower classes on a large scale. And of course, it does not impact women at all. There's no changes for women. There's no changes for your minor ethnic groups within the area. And so there's just a lot of reasons for people to be discontent with being under the rule of the Sultan. For the Russians, their biggest problem is the serfs. So the serfs were emancipated, but they weren't really free. So the serfs were put into these little communities called mirs, and the mirs were actually too small to meet the needs of the serf class. And so you end up with kind of the same thing for the Ottomans, this exodus out of the rural areas into some of the major cities. Now we'll look at that in regards to industrialization and economics in just a second. The landowners were compensated for the loss of their free labor with the serfs, but they still remain in political power. So of course you have these lower classes being angry that they have no political say, they have no voice in regards to their government, and they aren't meeting their basic needs at all. So that's not going to help their discontent with the czar. Industrialization creates a new working class out of those peasants that did manage to move into the cities, but unfortunately, every time you have new working classes, you're going to get all of the same things that happen in Britain and Germany and in the United States, where the working conditions are horrible, the living conditions are horrible, and so you're going to end up with social discontent there. Instead of responding to it like the British did with the Factory Act, or like the Germans did with healthcare and pensions and all that kind of stuff, the Russians are actually attempted to suppress it, and that just makes the discontent grow. There's also this new development of a new kind of educated class that the Russian historians call the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia were kind of these upper middle class, almost aristocratic people who managed to get their education in Europe. And as a result of that, they're coming back with enlightened ideas. Well, obviously, being an absolute monarch, that's not going to work well for the preservation of that system. And as the intelligentsia came back to Russia and they started educating some of the lower classes, we're going to see the discontent grow. For the Qing, it's very simple. There's zero social mobility. There's no way to move throughout Chinese society. That is old school Confucian ideology. Also, there's a huge amount of foreigners in China at this point, and so the Han Chinese are very discontent because technically you have all these European foreigners in the country on top of being controlled by the Manchu, who are not ethnically Chinese, and so that's going to create a lot of ethnic tension throughout the empire. You have a couple of military defeats with the Opium Wars, and then, of course, the Taiping Rebellion and the Basta Rebellion, which is going to heighten that social discontent because the masses out in the countryside are going to be affected by the opium, and they're going to be affected by the Taiping Rebellion on a large scale, and so they hear about movements against the Qing, and, of course, that's just going to increase the discontent. The other issue is that the royal family hid out in the Forbidden City. The Manchu family, the royal family, never really interacted with the masses. They stayed in the Forbidden City, which was huge. It was basically a city upon itself, and they didn't interact with anyone socially, and so that's going to create kind of this divide between the ruler and whom they're ruling, and so that starts to cause some problems as well. For the other biggest problem for all three of these empires is they didn't improve technologically. They didn't really industrialize on a large scale, or their foreign powers were the ones who were running the industrialization. So for the Ottomans, they tried to change things technologically in regards to their military, but the old military elites, the Janissaries, didn't want to change because they had a lot of power. They had a lot of political power. They had a lot of control over the Sultan. They had a lot of influence over the royal household because of that old dervish system and that old Janissary system. And so, of course, they don't want to modernize. And they didn't participate in any production industrialization. They weren't using steam engines. They weren't developing factory systems. They didn't really have anything to produce in regards to mass production. And so all of that's going to basically leave them in the 1600s, where they were successful in the 1700s, but they can't keep up with the Europeans and with this massive exchange of goods. For the Russians, they did participate in industrialization, but on a very limited scale. Most of the industrial goals for the Russians are in regards of military and expansion. So they're looking at the railways, they're looking at weaponry, but they're not doing manufacturing of textiles. They're not doing manufacturing of products, which doesn't make products cheaper for the Russian people, which, of course, will create more discontent. They didn't, and ultimately, they weren't even doing a very good job at that, and they don't have the military resources to be successful in World War I or in the previous war, the Russo-Japanese War, and so this is going to cause some serious issues for the Russians. As far as the Qing go, the Empress Cixi refused to modernize in general. She left all of the industrial moves to the foreigners. The Russians were building railways in the north. Obviously, the British were introducing some steam engine type of materials in the southern areas, like Hong Kong and whatnot. And so there's zero industrialization coming from the royal family at all. Obviously, there's a connection between the technological stagnation and their economy. So for the Ottomans, their problems start really with the Columbian Exchange and with imperialism. The British and the Dutch stopped overland trading in general, and so that's going to have a huge impact on the Ottoman economy. And then once the Suez Canal is built, they don't need the overland trade with the Ottomans at all. There's also the silver inflation that happened from the colonization from the 1700s, and that is basically their coins were debased, and they ended up having to increase taxes. But their system of taxation was also very corrupt. So what the Ottomans did was they sold the right to collect taxes to people called tax farmers. So their whole job is to basically collect taxes and then turn that money over to the royal coffers. Well, that wasn't happening. The tax farmers were corrupt. They were skimming money off the top. And so every time the Ottomans raised taxes, it just caused more and more burden to the majority of the people, which just makes them more angry. Ultimately, the government has run out of money, and they stopped paying workers. And so that's going to cause, obviously, discontent amongst the bureaucracy as well. European goods end up being a lot cheaper than homemade goods because of industrialization. And so those businesses are going to be shutting down because people aren't buying Ottoman goods anymore. They're buying the cotton textiles coming in for Britain. They're buying these foreign goods. So their isolation in regards to technology ends up creating massive economic issues for the Ottomans. For the Russians, their problem is really associated with this serf issue. So for a huge portion of Russian history, agriculture was based on unfree labor. And the whole purpose of that unfree labor is to support the Tsar's expansionist goals. Well, that's great. But the expansionist goals start to kind of fall by the wayside as empire building slows leading up to World War I. And there's a lack of quick and in success in industrialization in general for Russia. So that's going to cause their economic issues as well because they're not producing homemade goods either. One of the biggest problems for the Russian government is that they use loans to build the railway and to do any type of industrialization, and then they couldn't pay it back. So that's going to be a huge problem, which is going to impact their geopolitical status in Europe, which is part of the World War I issue. What ultimately results for Russia is this massive shortage in food and basic goods, which again is just going to create more discontent. For the Qing, they didn't have any control over their economies. They had very little control of their own resources at this point. Nobody really cares about silk anymore. Nobody really cares about porcelain production. Wedgwood China is now what the Europeans are purchasing because of that mass production of porcelain dinnerware and vases and luxury items. The Europeans are no longer dependent on Chinese goods. So what ends up happening is the Europeans are just extracting the natural resources from China, which is ultimately going to lead to massive economic turmoil for the Qing Empire. As far as military defeats, you definitely need to understand that all three of these, obviously, due to technological stagnation, economic issues, and social discontent, they're not going to be successful in fighting any foreign wars. So for the Ottomans, they lose a huge amount of lands to Russia early in the 1700s and 1800s, and ultimately, obviously, there's tensions between the Ottomans and Russians that are played out in the Crimean War. The Russians ultimately lose the Crimean War, but the Crimean War was about the British and the French making sure that Russia didn't get any more Ottoman territory. Well, the Ottomans barely even could fight in that war, and so it was this foreign war over territory that nobody knew what to do with, which again will ultimately lead to World War I. The Ottomans are also going to lose Romania and Hungary to the Austrians, and there's going to be some independence movements in the Balkans, which we've already discussed with that Balkanization of like Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina. All of that territory is going to basically just be lost to the Ottomans. Remember, the Ottomans are also going to lose Egypt as a result of Muhammad Ali movement into that area, as well as losing Greece and a whole bunch of other lands on the Mediterranean Sea. And then, of course, World War I is the ultimate military defeat for the Ottomans. World War I is also the ultimate military defeat for the Russians. The Russo-Japanese War in 1905 for the Russians, this was a huge embarrassment for the Russian psyche. The people become super discontent with the monarch not being able to defeat this upstart country called Japan that people hadn't really been paying attention to and didn't really know much about. And then, of course, the Russians were having serious issues in World War I. They didn't have enough guns and ammunition, so they paired people up, and you would hope that the other guy would die before you would. And so that causes some serious problems in regards to their showing on the Eastern fronts. And then Germany, one of the biggest problems for Russia is the result of Germany and Austria-Hungary not renewing this alliance that they had with Russia for centuries. Bismarck decided that Wilhelm I decided that he didn't want to be allied to this weakening Russian country, which again will increase tensions for World War I. And World War I is really kind of the nail in the coffins for Russia, because it's going to strain them economically and politically so much that it's just going to cause the massive overthrow of the Tsar. For the Qing, obviously they lose the Opium Wars. They're also losing territory to Japan. The French are taking out some of their territories in Indochina, like Vietnam. And then they are going to be annihilated in the First Sino-Japanese War, which you'll learn a little bit more about later in the unit. The political issues, of course, between all three of these are vast. For the Ottomans and the Qing, one of their biggest issues is nationalism. The idea of borders being associated with ethnicity. That for the Ottomans, there's so many different multi-ethnic groups in this territory that they've been controlling for centuries that all these people start to ask for their own borders. The same thing for the Qing. The people no longer want to be ruled by a foreign power called the Manchu. They just did not, they thought that they should be ruled by ethnic Chinese. So that's going to be a big problem for both of them. For the Ottomans, one of the biggest problems for them politically, actually, and for the Qing as well, is the royal family are pretty much uneducated. They've been isolated in their palaces. They haven't really been associating with any enlightened ideas or any of the movements or revolutions that's been happening all over the world. They don't understand basic economics. They don't understand politics. And so that lack of understanding is just going to continually weaken the royal family and weaken the monarchical power that these absolute rulers had maintained for so long. For the Ottomans, there's a huge failure of Tanzimat. They tried to reform. It doesn't work. For the Qing, they never try to reform, and Shishi managed to kind of control the reform movements and arrested people, and people would disappear and die and things of that nature. So that's a problem for them. One of the results of this nationalism, and one of the most vocal groups in nationalism, were the Armenians. And the Armenians end up being forced out of Ottoman territory and told to go elsewhere. And as a result of that, thousands of Armenians are going to die on this forced migration that were caused by Ottoman rulers. And Turkey, to this day, still says that the Armenian genocide did not happen. This year is the first year that the Armenian genocide is separated out in the key concepts for AP Worlds. So obviously the attitude about the Armenian genocide has changed as issues in Turkey keep increasing in regards to them wanting to be in the EU and wanting to be a global power. And one of the things that's preventing them from being recognized by the EU and being added to the EU is this lack of acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. And then, of course, you have the issues with World War I, which you'll learn more about as we go through the unit. For the Qing, you also had the unequal treaties and the spheres of influence that was going on with the Europeans. So the Qing had pretty much lost complete political control of their territory. And as a result of that, you get the rise of nationalism and the rise of this new ideology called communism. You'll look at that rise and the power of Mao Zedong later in the unit as well. Ultimately, Puyi, the last Qing emperor, will abdicate the throne on February 12, 1912. And he was 9 years old when he abdicates the throne. But he will actually remain in the Forbidden City and living his luxurious lifestyle until he's almost 30. So he isn't even removed from the Forbidden City, and he himself doesn't fully even comprehend that he's really not in charge anymore. As far as Russia goes, Russia's political issues are a little bit different from the Ottomans and the Qing. One thing is that as far as reforms go, they did try to give the peasants a voice. They created these local legislative assemblies called Zemstvos, and these Zemstvos were supposed to control like education and health and law on the local level. They're going to fail completely. They don't actually get to the Tsar. The issues that the Zemstvos wanted are not going to be addressed by the Tsar, which of course just creates more social discontent amongst the lower classes. As a result of that, we get the organization of socialist and communist parties. The political parties are forming and revolting quite often against this absolute monarch. A lot of their goals is to create a constitutional monarchy. There's different levels in regards to this massive socialist communist movement in Russia, and it takes a while for them to kind of unite into one political entity, which we will discuss when we look at Vladimir Lenin. As far as Alexander II goes, Alexander II is going to be assassinated in 1881 by kind of these political parties, and that is a huge hit for the idea of this absolute monarchy, and something that Nicholas II was very, very afraid of. And so Nicholas II ends up spending a huge portion of his reign trying to avoid assassination, which of course he will be assassinated in 1918. The Russians will try to create a national legislative assembly that they called the Duma, and the Duma is going to fail. The Tsar was basically the Romanov Tsars were just not willing to limit their power. They were absolute rulers, very Peter the Great idea, very this is our destiny, we've been absolute rulers for centuries, and this whole enlightened idea of a constitutional government, this whole even Hobbes' idea of a constitutional government is unacceptable to the Romanov family and the Romanov line. And the more that they push against the political parties who are asking for things like constitutions, the more violent the protest got throughout the end of the 1800s leading into the 1917 revolution. The Russians, the Tsar tried to kind of control things. Instead of reforming, he actually, outlaws trade unions, and he outlaws strikes, but that completely fails and causes them huge economic problems, which will also cause issues for their success in World War I. The Tsar oftentimes went to an old trick of the Tsars by just arresting and imprisoning anybody who had a different political ideal than absolute monarchy, and that ends up backfiring for them. These guys became martyrs to the cause, and the increased use of radio and newspaper print and the spread of education is just going to make things more difficult for the Tsar to control these new ideas that are coming up. Bloody Sunday is a specific revolt where it was a strike. It was a Soviet strike in the cities. And the Tsar actually takes his military and goes in and just kind of kills a bunch of people who were technically just protesting what the Tsar was doing and protesting the absolute power of the Tsar. And so this is where we see that military use for kind of personal bodyguards rather than for the protection of the country, which is something that we actually addressed in our Constitution and in our Declaration of Independence in the United States. We say, and in the Declaration of Human Rights by the French, we say that you cannot use the military for personal use. And the Tsar completely went against that enlightened ideal, which, again, Bloody Sunday is just going to make it worse for the Tsar. The Tsar ultimately abdicates in March of 1917, and then the entire Romanov family will be assassinated in 1918.